Sampson immediately, he described this book to Grace. He said, "It is very sharp. You see, they did not listen to me when I was moderate." He immediately sent a copy of this work, along with a letter from Archibald Hamilton Rowan to Thomas Jefferson. Only a few weeks later, Jefferson responded by describing the work as adding a monument the more of what a country loses when it loses its self-government. Perhaps Sampson's greatest success during these early years was a speech on the trial of James Cheetham for libeling Madame Bonneville, the lover of Thomas Paine, in a scurrilous biography. Paine's recent death offered tempting bait for the scurrilous biographer. Paine's early writings, including Common Sense and The Rights of Man, had done much to establish the intellectual underpinnings of the American-French revolutions, but in his last great work, The Age of Reason, Paine underestimated the powerful hold that institutional religion maintained on American citizens. His memory was defended by Madame Bonneville's advocate, William Sampson, in the courtroom, and also by Thomas Addis Emmet, who served as Tom Paine's executor. After the triumph of his advocacy for Madame Bonneville, Sampson was told that between newspapers and pamphlets, 25,000 copies of this speech were printed in several eastern cities. The extraordinary quantity and diversity of Sampson's writings can be seen from the rapid succession of publications which flowed from his pen during his first 5 years in the United States. As we have seen, in 1806, the year of his immigration, Bernard Dornan, another exiled United Irish rebel and printer, republished The Trial of Hurdy-Gurdy and followed it with another edition in 1807. Soon afterwards, there were other trials, the trial of Archularius against Coleman for a libel, the trial of Matron Livingston against James Cheetham, also for a libel, his memoirs. He published other trials, the trial of Dr. Little, the trial of the Commissioners of the Almshouse against Alexander Whistlow for the maintenance of a bastard child. Also his report of the trial of Amos Broad and his wife for beating their slave Betty and her 3-year-old child, Sarah. Another report of the trial of Lieutenant Renshaw for challenging Joseph Strong to a duel. In 1810, his edition of William Cooper's Guide in the Wilderness, a handbook for poor Irish settlers in the interior of the United States, together with his own introduction. In October of that year, of 1810, Sampson published his report of the trial of the journeymen cordwainers of the city of New York for a conspiracy to raise their wages by striking. And there are others also, too many to mention quickly here. He published many of these works for maybe $50 or $100, or even for barter for books. "I work from morning to night until night," he said. On one occasion, he said that it had become common to publish his speeches when they are upon any pleasant occasion and witty. "I wish I had an opportunity of sending you some of them. They would amuse you." It was in the trial of the journeymen cordwainers that he boldly announced his call for a post-colonial jurisprudence and a national code. He argued vigorously that the English common law, in a way that, of course, he would repeat in the Phillips case, giving rise to this prosecution, should be disregarded because it was based on a social order that was morally and politically unacceptable in a democratic republic. The English code and constitution are built upon the inequality of condition in the inhabitants. Sampson reminded the American court, "Here all are in one degree, that of citizens and equal in their rights. Here no man is subject, and no man lord or master." To allow that prosecution to proceed would give employers a legal method to ensure that the most useful class of workers grow poor as its oppressors grow rich. In 1810, he was joined by his wife and his 2 surviving children. After a 4-year gap, there had been a previous 4-year separation following 1798. During the spring of 1812, President Madison's reimposition of the embargo sent a clear signal that war was in the offing unless Britain abandoned its long-standing policies of seizing American ships and impressing its seamen. Sampson joined in the clamour. He published a biting satire that demolished the British government's insistence upon the legality of its impressment policy. His contribution, again, like Hurdy-Gurdy and others, cast as a fake trial, but unalloyed political propaganda underneath was the trial of Captain Henry Whitby for the murder of John Pierce with his dying declaration, and also the trial of Captain George Crimp for piracy and man-stealing. Although not so clear today, the significance of the title was very plain to Sampson's public. Crimp was the verb in common currency to describe the infamous work of the press gangs. In the vein of the trial of hurdy-gurdy, this satire reports 2 mock trials in which British officers are arraigned for the impressment of American seamen, and it contrasts the freedom and benevolence of an idealized United States against the tyranny and oppression inflicted by a rapacious Britain. His next great case, of course, you know as much about probably as most people, because that's People versus Phillips in 1813. There, as you know, I think, Sampson interjected when Father Coleman made his statement to the court, in which he said that he would have to prefer death or any other temporal misfortune rather than reveal the secrets of the confessional. Sampson jumped up, introduced himself as an amicus curiae, and I think there really is no other instance of a group amicus curiae, test case, cause lawyering that comes so early as this. It really is something very like Brown versus Board of Education, which of course is so much later. So it's an extraordinary role which he takes in this case. We don't have all of the details of it. He wasn't writing to his wife at that time because, of course, they were together. And the scene with the trustees, while it's in many ways suggested from the letter that the trustees wrote saying that they wanted to go forward with the trial, much of that was a reconstruction rather than being based on the details which we have in the report of the trial itself. Despite his rhetorical victory in Phillips, William Sampson's work was not done. As Michael James Callaghan has pointed out, while Sampson's influence and his place in American legal history are lasting because of his association with the codifiers, he also possessed a more arcane talent which helped ensure the spread of his legal outlook. And this is a reference to Sampson's command of shorthand, which he had, again, deliberately mastered this skill in Ireland for political reasons. And so this was his practice of using the courtroom as his own soapbox and then publishing accurate reports of the trials that he transformed and engineered into high politics. He had begun this practice in Ireland, where he sought to expose the politically incorrupt and indefensible nature of the imposed English common law. Sampson developed his skill as a stenographer to combat the government's control over legal ideology. And his publication of the Catholic Question is very much in this tradition. And over time, it was cited several times in courts before the Civil War, and it was also codified in 1828 at a time when Sampson was leading a movement to codify American law. The priest-penitent privilege was captured in this, reduced to a code in New York, later also put into a code form in California during the gold rush, from which place it ricocheted back eastwards, if you like, as the American expansion westward continued and the California codes were copied in many, many states. So that it was eventually, in the 1960s, there was only 6 states which did not have the priest-penitent privilege, 3 in New England, in the Northeast, and 3 in the South. But today, all 50 states have adopted the privilege, which Sampson originally established based on the constitutional argument. Sampson expressed his pride in making this report public. In his introduction, he said, "The general satisfaction given to every religious denomination," he said, "is well calculated to dissipate antiquated prejudices and religious jealousies." He extolled the Phillips decision as representing an emerging post-colonial jurisprudence in Republican America. He said, "When this adjudication shall be compared with the baneful statutes and judgments in Europe upon similar subjects," in his introduction, "the superior equity and wisdom of American jurisprudence and civil probity will be felt." And he rightly predicted as we know today, that his report of Phillips would constitute a document of history precious and instructive to the present and future generations. And the following year, it was published in Dublin, and you'll reach a certain point in his transcription of the arguments where there's an insertion saying that the following material needed to be omitted because of the seditious libel laws still in place in that country. One of Sampson's close friends and correspondents in Paris was David Bailey Warden, another banished United Irish Protestant exile of 1798, who served an important role as an informal cultural ambassador. In 1819, several years after its publication in New York, Warden sent Sampson the Parisian journal Chronique Religieuse's recent review of the Catholic question in America. The reviewer is none other than Bishop Henry Gregoire, the fearless and uncompromising Catholic cleric and Republican, with personal reasons for welcoming Sampson's eloquent defense of religious toleration, having successfully defied the various brands of despotism exerted in turn by Robespierre, Napoleon, Louis XIII, and the Quadruple Alliance. In his fulsome praise for Sampson's argument in Phillips, the venerable Gregoire mistook the religion of its impassioned advocate. After reading the bishop's review in the Chronique Religieuse, the Protestant Sampson wryly told Warden that if I was not past the days of vanity and ambition, I should be greatly elated to see that I was so main a pillar of the faith. We were all much amused by it, though if there came some profit by it, it would be more amusing still. But in fact, the praise of Bishop Gregoire, a true Republican and Democrat, meant a great deal to the banished Irish advocate. And almost a decade later, in a letter to his friend Julian Verplanck on the eve of Catholic emancipation in the British Parliament, Sampson was still smiling at the thought that his support for auricular confession had gone so near to canonize me and procured me the benediction of the great Bishop Gregoire. In the years following the Phillips case, Sampson remained active and in some ways increased his influence to really make his mark upon jurisprudence and also upon literature. Among other things, he also lobbied for domestic manufacturers, went to Washington where he was hosted by President Monroe to do that. He published an extraordinary report of Is a Whale a Fish, which was written about in a beautiful book from Princeton just about a year ago. In 1820, Sampson's only surviving son, who had just started up a newspaper in New Orleans, died of yellow fever in his 20s, which was tragic, leaving him only his daughter, Catherine. Sampson, in the years that followed that, as I have mentioned, he led his attack on the English common law with his famous 1823 Discourse on the Common Law, which he published in the same year that William Fenimore, as James Fenimore Cooper, published the first American novel. So this was the nationalization of literature and law, a common enterprise of separating from England. We have also mentioned that Sampson also argued the Greenwich Village Orange Day trials, and in those, the judge was Richard Riker, none other than Richard Riker, now the recorder of New York, who served as a judge in this case, and who in many ways incorporated much of Sampson's ideals in his judgment, and also in other speeches which he gave at that time. Sampson moved to Washington, D.C. in 1826 and lived there with Matilda Tone and her son and, of course, Sampson's daughter. They were married and a grandchild. It was during that time that Tone published in 2 volumes the diaries of Theobald Wolfe Tone, which became the iconic foundation in many ways of Irish republicanism. They're written with the kind of verve which Sampson also had, and they became something of a Bible for Irish nationalists, if you like. It was probably the single most influential work of Irish American nationalist Republican historiography. And the fact that it was produced with the 3 generations of Sampsons and Tones living under the one roof I think is significant, and I think we can see Samson's hand in some sense there too. So, yeah, I'm just finishing up. So, a couple of final observations of him from those who knew him. In his final years, he made an effort to go back to Ireland, but this conditions were attached to it which he would not accept. And one of his correspondents, the son of another executed Irish rebel, Senator Porter in this country, said, "I can readily account for your anxiety to have the Bill of Attainder and Banishment, which excludes you from Ireland, repealed." He wrote, "Perhaps if I were in your situation, I would share it. It's quite possible that I should, but I confess that with my present feelings, I think you ought not to desire it. Let it remain, and do not seek to expunge it. Your posterity will one day be proud to point to it as proof of the virtue of their ancestry. There is nothing of which I am so jealous as the fact that I am the son of a man who died a martyr to the wrongs of his native land." In his last surviving letter, Samson told his daughter Catherine that his disease seemed to be developing in a new form and verging to a crisis. He suffered from dropsy in his final year in 1836. "I'm willing to hope the best and, on the other hand, quite reconciled and ready for whatever may come. I think you have nothing to apprehend for me that need trouble your mind. And I pray you to enjoy all the pleasures that good company, rural scenery, flowers, blossoms, and fruits, music, and song can afford." Grace mentioned to Samson's daughter that Dr. McNevin had just been there tending to his friend Samson, and she called in that letter Samson by the nickname Lion, which he had earned in 1794 for one of his satires. After this long illness, Samson died of dropsy at the end of 1836. A dissident Irish Protestant tended in his last days by his old United Irish friend and comrade, the Catholic doctor William James McNevin. In death, Samson and McNevin were eventually laid side by side overlooking picturesque Bowery Bay in the plot of the Riker family, where they had found refuge in the relative freedom and equality of antebellum America. A tomb of white marble was erected over Samson's remains, which have since been moved to Greenwood Cemetery. It bears the following inscription: "Beneath this stone lie the mortal remains of William Samson, born in Londonderry, Ireland, January 27, 1764, died in New York, December 28, 1836. An United Irishman, he defended the cause of civil and religious liberty. His countrymen requited his services by their love. His enemies attested his wisdom and atoned for their persecution by adopting his measures. The cheerful temper and invincible mind that supported him in the dungeons of the Inquisition sustained him during his long exile and through his last, most painful illness, and shed an affecting serenity round his departing spirit. He was resigned to the will and trusted in the mercy of his God. This stone is erected and inscribed to his memory by an affectionate wife and only daughter." Thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'm certainly happy to take one or two if anyone would like to.
Brian McCaffrey.
Yes, did Samson ever seek to be restored to the bar in Ireland? I know he's admitted in New York, but did they ever restore him in Ireland? Was Samson restored to the bar in Ireland, or did they ever seek to be restored?
You know, he was not. He never was, although in 1798, on the bicentennial of the rebellion, 2 plaques were put up in the round hall of the Four Courts. So that's actually the area which all of the Supreme Court judges would walk through, and you will see them there on either side. The documents I showed you earlier are quite interesting because there is a technical inaccuracy in them. They are all required, the various lawyers are required to show cause why they should not be disbarred. Samson's name is not repeated in 2 places where it should be. So an enterprising lawyer might actually argue in Samson's case that there's a technical defect in it. But no, he hasn't been restored. It would be, I think, a good thing to do, but Senator Porter's sentiment might be another way of thinking about it.
What was the function of a court reporter in those days? And I'm just wondering if part of the flower of the chemistry of his writing, etc., might have in part come from hearing all of these people and being in a relatively unique position, not only hearing them, but actually rewriting them or recording them, whatever the function of a court reporter.
It very much is. I mean, Sampson is interesting not only as an extraordinary individual in his own right, but because his life, through these trials, we know much of early American labor history comes from his report on the Cordwainers trial, for example. So these cases become places where people who were not even necessarily literate, he has the verbatim words as if a tape recorder was on, and his cases and his work give glimpses, much more than glimpses, into whole areas of social life that would otherwise be unknown to us. The role of the court reporter today, law students read just appellate opinions from judges. That's looking through the wrong end of the telescope. When you read it this way, you see how these cases were made. He was a private law reporter. Official law reports weren't introduced generally until even the 1820s, when courts began to pay to have the reports officially recorded. He was part of an earlier generation, and in his case, it was not simply to make a profit, but it was actually to show the failure of the Irish system. So he was a very pioneering figure, and one pamphlet written about him was actually published by the American Stenographers Association, because they were so intrigued at his own unique form of shorthand notation, which he developed to do this. Maybe one more?
Has he been recognized in Derry itself, publicly or otherwise?
I'm not aware that he has, but that could be simply because I haven't gone there to look. I think his name may be known. There's a particular parish there, which of course was his family parish, the Anglican parish there. So the roots of the family were certainly there, but I'm not aware of anybody making the connection in recent years, no.
Yeah, I have a question, Walter.
Oh, okay.
You spoke about his experiences with the Irish peasantry as a possible influence on him. Do we know anything else about other influences where his ideas got, what was the source of his ideas? Was his father a specific influence, particularly with respect to social, political power arrangements?
We really don't. His brother George was somewhat of a moderate reformer, certainly not antagonistic towards Catholics, but not anywhere radical in the way that Sampson certainly became, if he didn't begin that way. In terms of what the other influences would be, it's actually very difficult to trace those. I mean, it is amazing to read these cases in which he shows this incredible command of everything from classical antiquity and language. He can move from Latin to Greek. He's knowledgeable about current theories of science, and a case involving the race of the bastard child I mentioned, for example, is a whale of fish. It's really the current, leading edge of science. He can master all of this. At the same time, he never went to university. It was sometimes said that he went to Trinity, but that's not an accurate statement. So apart from his education in London around the time when The Rights of Man was being published, it really was just a milieu in which there was a shared appreciation of learning and knowledge, and also not the compartmentalization into separate disciplines that we have today. So the recent book from Princeton on Is a Whale of Fish, one of the reviewers of that noted that the oratory, it's something that is unimaginable today. And I think that's a true statement. It's a classical learning is what we would call it, perhaps. So thank you very much. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Walter.